Thank you very much, Alan, for this nice introduction. Thank you to Wayne for inviting me to this conference. It's my great honor and privilege to be here today. It's my first time in Australia, first time in Sydney. And my task today is to give you a brief summary of what we as academic researchers in the field of media violence have to say about the strength of the evidence for a link between using violent media and aggressive behavior. I should say that I've approached this whole area as a social psychologist, not as a media researcher. As a social psychologist interested in the question of what makes people engage in aggressive behavior and what the role of media depictions of violence might be in this context. Before I start, I want to make a few general statements. And the first is that I want to explain what, in my view, is the issue here. It's sometimes stated that media violence researchers make the claim that anyone who ever watches a crime thriller or plays a violent video game is inevitably going to turn into a violent criminal. This is not the statement that describes the approach the scientific community takes. We are interested in the issue of whether exposure to violence in the media promotes aggression, and if so, how, by what processes. And since I'm the first speaker this morning, I thought it might help to lay out some of the groundwork on which my presentation will be based, and also which I'm sure the other speakers will base theirs on. And that has to start with a definition of what we consider to be covered by the term of aggression. And as social psychologists, we define aggression as behavior carried out with the intention to harm another person. And it's the intention that counts, it's not the effect. And we consider aggression to be a social behavior, an interpersonal behavior or behavior directed at other social groups. And within this construct of aggression, violence is a subcategory denoting severe forms of physical aggression, behavior carried out with the intention to inflict severe physical harm on another person. Aggression comes in different forms. It comes in physical forms, in kicking or hitting, as verbal aggression in the form of insults and abuse, and also increasingly recognized as relational aggression, sometimes also called indirect aggression, which is in behavior carried out with the intention to harm another person's social relationships. Many of you will be familiar with the concept of bullying, which covers many of these different forms, and which is also a form of aggression that can make life miserable for a large number of young people and also adults. We measure aggression in a variety of ways in our research. We use self-reports, and I will be showing you some findings based on self-reports where we ask people to indicate how many times they have shown certain behaviors, such as kicking, insulting, harming someone's social relationships. We rely on reports by other people, ask teachers, parents, classmates to comment on aggressive behavior by our research participants. And in our experimental studies, of course, we cannot allow people to intentionally harm other individuals, so we have to resort to proxy behaviors. For example, giving our participants the chance to administer loud, aversive noise blasts, or making other people eat large amounts of unpleasantly hot sauce. And we're not interested in these behaviors as such. We are using them as approximations to aggression as a form of behavior intended to harm. Now, the second half of our problem, the second construct involved, is media violence. And our definition of media violence is modeled on the definition of aggressive behavior, in the sense of media presentations of behaviors intended to harm another person or animated character. It also covers video games involving the harming or destruction of game characters. And media violence has a number of distinctive characteristics, one of which are the human-like features of game characters or avatars. Some video games allow you to personalize the characters or avatars in the games. The focus is often on physical aggression. As has been stated before, winning or advancing is sometimes only possible by harming or killing opponents, and helping behavior, pro-social behavior, is typically either not possible or associated with negative effects for the player. I thought I'd also give you some background of how prominently violence features in different types of media. And we have evidence from content analyses of TV programs, movies, video games, songs, music videos, various types of media, looking at the extent to which violence is present in these media types. And these content analyses, for example, have shown that with age ratings, which you will probably all be familiar with, there has been a constant lowering of the threshold for violence, so that an age rating, for example, of 12, that's a category we have in Germany, would cover increasing levels of violence over the years in a process which is called the ratings creep. We know from large-scale surveys that violent media are used intensively, extensively across different age groups, although one has to say, and this is also reflected in this conference, that there is a special concern about children and adolescents. We also know from research that it's difficult to monitor and regulate access of young people to violent media contents. For example, warning labels stating that certain films or video games contain violence are often counterproductive in actually increasing the appeal of these media to young people, something that's called the forbidden fruit effect. And we can tell not only from our academic research, but also from our hands-on experience as parents, that monitoring children's access to violent media contents gets increasingly difficult as the children get older. I also want to give you some even more general background. Again, this is something that the previous speaker has already touched upon, which is also going to come up again, I think, throughout this conference. Why is it that people have such trouble acknowledging harmful effects of violent media? I think it helps to break it down to a more general level, because what we're talking about here is a possible transfer from experiences in the media world to the real world. And that there is such a transfer, that the two realms in a way are connected, is widely accepted without any problems in various domains of our lives. For example, the whole idea of commercial advertising is based on the assumption that what people see advertised on television is likely to affect their consumer behavior next time they go to the supermarket. If there wasn't such a link, it wouldn't make sense to spend so much money on commercial advertising. Or airline pilots are trained in flight simulators before they are allowed to fly a real plane. Again, this would make no sense if we didn't assume a connection between experience in a virtual reality and our experiences in the real world. And we would also, I think we can claim and show that this transfer from the virtual reality to our everyday life can be explained by broad underlying processes, such as social learning, practicing of motor skills, and also effects at the cognitive and affective level. And the message is that the processes are essentially the same. It's the content that matters. It's the violent content that affects violence-related outcomes. And I think that's important to bear in mind as a kind of general line of reasoning when we talk about effects of media violence. So moving more specifically to the research I'm supposed to cover, I've just selected a few summary findings here to give you an impression of what we know and what our database is. These are findings from a meta-analysis combining effects from many different studies, and the view here is organized by research methodology. And you can see that we have cross-sectional studies connecting reports about violent media use with measures of aggressive behavior. We have longitudinal studies where we follow the same participants over several data waves, several years. We have laboratory experiments where we present people with violent media contents and compare their responses to groups that have seen non-violent media examples. And we also have a few field experiments in natural contexts. For those of you who are not totally familiar with the stats side of things, I have to wander around a little bit. Right? This column there represents the strength of the association between media violence use and aggression found across the large number of studies. It's a weighted correlation coefficient and can take values from -1 to +1. And you can see that the signs are all positive here. So the meta-analysis found a positive association between media violence use and aggression across these different methodologies, although the effects are not that strong. And that just means that in addition to media violence use, there are other influences on aggressive behavior. So I don't think it's reasonable to claim that violent media are the only reasons why people behave aggressively. They are one influence among others, but the important point is that they have a measurable effect. I also compiled some data on the strength and the growth of the evidence base. And here the only thing you can see is the number of studies and the number of participants. And I thought this might be useful to show how large the database is that we have accumulated so far. The 2004 meta-analysis by Craig Anderson. Craig, you would have been a better person to present this firsthand, but that shows that we had about 25 or so studies on violent video games. Then in 2010, you can see a sharp increase in the number of studies, but the 2010 meta-analysis also covered some of the studies included in the earlier one. Whereas the 2014 meta-analysis by Greitemeyer and Mügge only included studies published after the 2010 meta-analysis. So this is a real addition in numbers, and you can see that research interest has grown quite substantially over the last 10 years or so. And the other graph just depicts the number of participants in these studies combined in the meta-analysis. Now, what do the findings show in terms of the associations with a range of aggression-related outcomes? So far, I've only talked about aggressive behavior as the critical outcome variable, but we also want to understand the underlying processes. And for that, we have to look at aggressive thoughts, aggressive cognitions, at aggressive affect in the form of anger, at physiological arousal, the bodily responses to confrontation with violent media. And we are also increasingly concerned about effects on pro-social behavior. And this is a negative correlation indicating that the more violent media people consume, the less likely they are to show helping behavior. Now, you'll hear more about critical voices about this line of research, and one criticism that's been constantly leveled at media violence researchers presenting these associations is that the poor quality of research in this area leads to a dramatic overestimation of any harmful effects. So Craig, in his meta-analysis in 2010, categorized the studies into good practice or strong studies and weak studies and compared the effect sizes. And the weak studies are the ones in light blue, the strong studies are the darker ones, and you can see with the exception of anger, where the difference is non-significant, that the stronger studies also provide stronger effects. So it's not convincing to dismiss the evidence on the grounds of methodological criticisms. Now, this meta-analytic research combines studies or findings from different studies all over the world. It's also worth looking at the extent to which the effects of violent media are consistent across cultures. In the meta-analysis I've just mentioned, there was no evidence of moderation by culture, comparing Eastern and Western cultures. But that was a kind of secondary analysis of studies collected in different parts of the world. We also have studies in which the cultural comparison was a built-in feature, and one of them was conducted comparing Germany, the United States, and Singapore by Doug Gentile and our group at Potsdam. And we found significant longitudinal path from violent media use to aggressive behavior in all three countries. And in fact, the findings were remarkably similar. And in a more recent 7-country study, including Australia and including Wayne and Craig as collaborators, and you can see we have developed into quite an active research network internationally. We looked at the association of media violence use with aggression in these 7 countries. And when you look at the country associations, you can see not only that significant associations between media violence use and aggression were found in each of the 7 nations, you can also see that the findings overall look pretty similar. So even though the societal conditions in these countries are likely to differ quite a bit, we still find a fairly homogeneous picture of the extent to which media violence is linked to aggression. From this kind of summary view, I would like to move on a little bit towards explaining what happens, psychologically speaking, in the process from being confronted with violent media to aggressive behavior as our outcome variable. And I want to focus on the long-term effects because I will be presenting findings from a longitudinal study that we conducted in Germany in a moment. So we have the habitual use of media violence as a kind of input variable. We propose that there is the risk of a long-term increase in aggression at the outcome level, and we want to understand what happens in between of these two things. The first 2 boxes here in the middle refer to cognitive processes that may explain the underlying psychological mechanisms. I will not mention them in detail because they will be covered in depth by Raoul Huesman, who's the next speaker. I want to look at 2 specific mediating variables, the extent to which violent media make aggression seem normal, normatively acceptable, and the impact of habitual use of media violence on aggression by way of emotional desensitization, that is, weakening the emotional response to viewing violence over time. I want to start with the latter point, with emotional desensitization, and present you the findings from a an experimental study, which I will talk you through very briefly. As I said before, in experimental research, participants are typically assigned to either a violent media depiction group or a non-violent media depiction group. In our study, we compared responses within the person to a violent video film clip on the one hand, and a funny or sad comparison clip on the other hand. And you can see that we use 2 film clips for the violent side, Reservoir Dogs or Casino, very short clips. That's important to bear in mind for the findings later, 2 to 4 minutes. And for the sad condition, we used clips from 2 commercial movies, The Champ and Stepmom. And for the funny comparison clips, we used scenes from 2 Monty Python movies. I should mention that the funny clips were the hardest to find because humor is very much a question of individual taste and preference, and to find something which people consistently find funny was not easy. We got people to rate their emotional response, how much they enjoyed watching the 2 short film clips, how much anxiety they felt. And we also measured their skin conductance level as a measure of physiological arousal. At the outcome level, we measured people's accessibility of aggressive cognitions, that is, the speed with which they could recognize a series of letters as an aggression-related word or a non-aggressive word. And we used a standard paradigm to measure aggressive behavior, which I've already briefly mentioned, assigning aversive noise blasts to an alleged other person. And we also measured various other variables that might affect aggressive behavior, because our interest was in showing the impact of violent media use over and above the influence of these other factors. I'm just going to show you a few findings from this study. First of all, we looked at whether people differed in their response to the violent film clips depending on how used they were to seeing violence in the media. And you can see that these correlations are all negative. That is to say, people were less anxious, reported less anxiety when they watched these really quite violent film clips, the more they used media violence habitually. They showed less increase in anxiety relative to the increase in anger, which was stimulated by watching these aggressive scenes. And at the physiological level, nothing to do with self-reports or introspection, we found that people who were used to watching violence in the media also responded less, with less arousal at the physiological level. But our main interest was in predicting 2 outcome variables. One was the recognition time for aggressive words. And I'm not expecting you to go through this complicated model. What I want to show is that people who watch a lot of violent media report more pleasant arousal when they see people shot, tortured, and battered to death, and that the more pleasant arousal they report, the faster they are at recognizing words with an aggressive meaning. So that's a very important finding for us, because it shows that exposure to violent media actually does something to the evaluation of violence, and also to the speed with which people can activate aggressive thoughts. The second outcome measure from this study was aggressive behavior, assigning those loud noise blast. An unprovoked aggression is the very first noise blast somebody assigns to an alleged opponent before the other person had a chance to do anything. And here again we find that the more violent media they use, the more pleasantly aroused they are. The more pleasantly aroused they are, the less anxiously aroused people are, and the less anxiously aroused they are, the more unprovoked behavior they show. So anxiety, which could potentially buffer the effects of media violence, is reduced the more people perceive the violence as pleasant to watch. Okay, just a few conclusions from this study. We could show in this experimental study that the habitual use of violent media was linked to greater enjoyment of violent stimuli, to reduced short-term anxious reactivity. This is the physiological data. Greater enjoyment of violent films was linked to enhanced accessibility of aggressive thoughts, in a way alerting the individual to the possibility of an aggressive response. Reduced anxious reactivity was linked to more unprovoked aggressive behavior. And what I haven't shown you in detail is that we didn't find any of these effects for exposure to the sad or the funny movies. So the effects are specific to violent content, which is in line what we would expect theoretically. In the next, this is, as you can see, a very artificial situation. It's just 2 to 4 minutes of video clips, and it's a highly artificial way of measuring aggressive behavior. So we wanted to know what happens when we look at this association in a more realistic context. And usually what people do when they want to demonstrate long-term effects of violent media, they run longitudinal studies, which are definitely a very good thing to do because we can look at the extent to which aggression goes up in relation to media violence over time. But the problem with longitudinal studies is always that there are possible third variables, we would call them other influences that we haven't measured or haven't thought of that might explain the effects. On the other hand, experimental studies, as you could see, can test causal effects because people are randomly assigned to the experimental conditions, but they are only short-term effects. And in the area of violent media, it's ethically not feasible to run an experimental study in which young people are exposed to high doses of media violence over time. But we came up with the idea that it would be ethically feasible to expose them to a treatment that would reduce the exposure to violent media. And that's why we developed an intervention program in Germany, which we built into our ongoing longitudinal study in the hope to be able to show that by an intervention seeking to reduce the use of violent media, we can also reduce aggression over the course of time. The intervention was integrated into a 5-year longitudinal study, for which luckily we got funding from the German Research Foundation. We selected from a large sample of adolescents a subsample for our intervention, for which we then defined a matched control group. We did this in a school setting, so for each year and school, we selected one class for the intervention and randomly assigned from the range of parallel classes a second class as our control group. We measured aggression and media violence and non-violent media use at the beginning of the study, then did the intervention, then at the second data wave, 7 months after the intervention, we measured the efficacy of the intervention. And then we had 2 further follow-ups, 12 and 24 months later. And as you can see, the intervention was published as a book complete with the training materials. I think I'll skip this next slide. We had a sample of 2,200 adolescents, starting when they were in year 7, which is when they start secondary school in Berlin, where we conducted the study, and following them up over the next 4 years. So just a few select findings, first of all, on the strength of the association between media violence and aggression. This is the change from the first to the second data wave for the longitudinal study sample who hadn't received any intervention at all. And you can see, in line with the size of the effects that you've seen before, looking at teacher-rated aggression at time 2, media violence exposure, which was television, movies, and video games, was positively linked to teacher-rated aggression 12 months later, controlling, and that's an important point, controlling for the level of aggression at the beginning of the study. We also got self-report measures from the participants, which show a similar effect. And it's also worth noting that the reverse diagonal path from aggression to media violence use was non-significant, and this is true for all of our findings. So it's not the case that those kids who are more aggressive have a greater preference for violent media. It's the other way around. It's the preference for violent media that leads to more aggression. We also found a negative effect on empathy. The more violence they use at the beginning of the study, the less empathic they were 12 months later. We did not, just to dispel the impression that all our predictions are always confirmed, we did not find an effect on relational aggression. That was the form of aggression where the point is to damage someone's social relationships. So media violence exposure had no impact on that in our data, which is not that surprising given that the media violence itself was mostly physical harm. And we also didn't find, and this was a non-finding that we'd hoped to obtain, that we also saw that non-violent media exposure was totally unrelated to aggression, as it should be, because I said at the beginning it's the content that matters, and there is no theoretical reason to assume that exposure to non-violent media should affect aggression. It may have other unpleasant effects, like causing obesity or interfering with school performance, but it's not related to aggression, and I think that's a critical point. Now, because we had these 4 data waves, we were able to categorize our participants into distinct groups in terms of their media violence use. And we identified 3 groups in our data. As you can see, a stable low group across the 4 data waves, 12 months apart. There's a substantial group of youngsters in this unselected secondary school population characterized by low levels of media use. We also found a stable high group, the yellow group, who started off with a relatively high level, always relative to the other kids in the sample. And we found a group that showed declining media violence use over time. That's the green use. So if you just remember for a second the pattern that you've seen, because next I want to show you the pattern for the groups categorized on the basis of their aggressive behavior. And when I go back, you can see it very clearly. The patterns look very similar. So we find parallel trajectories for media violence use and for aggressive behavior. How am I doing for time, Alan? Can I?
Not bad.
Not bad.
Another
Okay.
minute or so, is that okay?
1 minute?
No. I'll give you more than that.
Okay, I just want to move on to the intervention very briefly, because I thought maybe for several of you this might be interesting from an applied point of view. The intervention, as I said, was built into this longitudinal study. The people who took part in the intervention, of course, were not included in the data that I've just shown you. And we designed our intervention based on our theoretical knowledge about media violence effects, and we thought we should try and reduce dosage, exposure to violent media. We should promote self-regulatory behavior, teaching our participants skills to do other things than set up the computer and play violent video games all day. And we should also make them aware of the harmful effects of violent media use. The intervention consisted of 2 core modules. The media use module was designed to analyze personal media use habits, specifically violent media use, and was designed to reduce violent screen media. For example, part of the intervention was to keep a media-free weekend. Just to show you what this intervention material looked like, for example, in terms of monitoring their own media use, our participants were asked to keep a media diary and list for each day how much time of the day they spend using media. And we also made them reflect on their violent media use, thinking about their favorite games, thinking about how much violence the game contained, and how the players behave towards each other and the other game characters. So this was the violent media use unit. And the module that we called Media Violence was designed to help participants to recognize the various forms in which violence comes across in media depictions, and also in understanding the effects of media violence. And this is a typical example from the material, where we explain to them what happens to people when they watch a lot of violence in the media, that they get used to it. This is the habituation experience, that it makes them feel less sympathy with victims in the media, which again makes them less empathic to the plight of victims of real-life violence, and changes their normative evaluation. So that's essentially conveying information about harmful effects of media violence. Just very briefly, some effects. This is just comparing the baseline measure before the intervention to the first post-intervention assessment 7 months later, and we could find a significant reduction of self-reported media violence use in the intervention group. So you may say, of course, people in the intervention group knew that they had been in the intervention, and so this might just reflect socially desirable responding on the basis of, on the part of our nice participants. But we can show that this reduction of violent media use carries through until the 4th data wave, the final assessments, more than 2.5 years later, by which time I think people will not have been aware that much of the intervention itself. So this is a main effect. So the intervention group as a whole reported less media violence use than the control group. Looking at aggressive behavior, we found no effect amongst the low aggressive kids. They remained low in aggression, no matter how much, no matter whether they were in the intervention or the control group. But for those who started off with comparatively high levels of aggression, we found that in the untreated group, in the control group, the level of aggression was substantially higher than in our intervention group. And finally, we also looked at the normative acceptance of aggression, the extent to which they thought aggression was okay in certain situations. And again, we found an effect only in the highly aggressive group to begin with. Those in the intervention group were less accepting of aggression than those in the control group. And we would argue that it's this group that starts off with a relatively high level of aggression is the critical group where the intervention should work. Okay, so the intervention effects after 7 months show that we managed to reduce violent media use in our intervention sample, which also included the parents, by the way. We had 2 parents' evenings, the beginning at the end. And the effects of the intervention on aggression and normative beliefs about aggression were limited to those participants who started off with initially high levels of aggression. I've got some more slides showing you the long-term effects, which I think I'm going to skip, but I'm happy to come back in the discussion after my talk, or in the discussion session at lunchtime. The long-term intervention effects were that we still found an indirect effect of the intervention up until the final data wave. And also, more importantly, we found a reduction in aggression that could be attributed to the reduction in violent media use that we managed to achieve through our intervention. And what I haven't been able to show you for time reasons is that we find that in the untreated group, in the control group, normative aggression, acceptance of aggression continuously goes up beyond the 2nd data wave, and the association between, negative association between empathy and media violence only happens in the control group over time, not in the intervention group. final slide, I want to make a case for combining longitudinal and experimental designs in the way that we have tried to demonstrate, because it enables us to achieve greater control over possible additional variables that might explain aggression as our outcome measure. We can show sustainable effects of the intervention on media violence use. And I think the finding that experimentally reducing violent media use actually reduces aggression is also a way of testing the hypothesis that there is a causal role for violent media in explaining aggressive behavior. Right, my last but one slide is to acknowledge the great contribution of my team in Potsdam and my international collaborators, some of whom you will hear speaking later, and to thank you for your attention. Thank you very much.